it's Debbie from Line Doodle Design, and thank you for joining me for Doodling with Debbie. When I saw the new Delicate Outline Flower set from Simon Says Stamp, from their new Rainbows release, I knew I had to paint it. My first thought was to heat emboss the design in antique gold embossing powder and use the raised heat emboss lines to resist some quick and easy watercolouring. However, in the end, no line watercolouring won, as I felt this technique lets the gorgeous bloom shine. My usual first step for no-line watercolouring is to stamp the image in antique linen distress ink. However, my aim with this set was to have a muted pinks and greens palette, and I wasn't sure the creamy colour of antique linen really fit well with that, especially as I wanted the paint to wash out to virtually nothing in areas to give highlight details. And again, I wasn't sure a cream line around the petals would fit with that. So I pulled out a couple of distress markers and coloured the stamp before stamping onto Fabriano Artistico Extra White Cold Press watercolour card. I picked a light pink spun sugar and a light green bundled sage and coloured in the petals and leaves with the brush end of the markers. I coloured and stamped a few times until I had a clear impression to paint. I knew I wanted black anthers for the flower centres, and rather than paint and then add the anthers at the end, I decided to draw in the anthers before painting so that I could easily see where to draw. I used a black Micron pen. This is waterproof and so won't be affected by the paint and water I add over the top. I wasn't too precise but kept roughly to where the anthers were on the stamped image, and I kept the stamp set beside me to guide me also. I'm a fan of a mucky muted palette, and this card turned out with quite a Victorian feel to it, I think. I used a lot of colours that were already mixed on my palette, but the base of the flower mix was pyrrole crimson, with some green pulled across to knock back the brightness of the red. I ended up working with 3 brushes for this painting session. I had a larger size 8 round synthetic brush loaded with what was effectively my mid-value. I then pulled out the colour with a damp brush, and for this I used a size 6 round synthetic brush. This damp brush with just plain clear water is effectively working as the highlights. Then for the darkest colour, I brought in a concentrated mix on a smaller size 4 round synthetic brush for the shadows. This type of painting session for me is very relaxing and therapeutic because it is repetitive. I painted each petal or leaf in the same way, starting with the mid-value brush and adding to the area closest to the flower centre where the shadows would be. I then pulled out the colour with the damp brush to create highlights. While the paint was still wet, I went in with a smaller brush loaded with a concentrated mix for the shadows. This method relies on the wet and wet technique, whereby working with wet paint, the colours mix and merge together. I then repeated this process over and over again, petal after petal. I moved around painting a few flowers at once so that I could leave each petal to dry fully before painting its neighbours. This prevents 2 petals blending together when wet. As I mentioned, this process is relaxing to me, but it is time consuming. I think the whole card took me over 2 hours to complete. However, this is my me time. I close the door to the craziness that is our household working from home in a pandemic, with a rambunctious 1-year-old dog thrown into the mix. I breathe and relax, petal after petal, leaf after leaf. For the leaves, I used a Peroline green mix with sepia for the stems. I love Peroline green, and in the same way I added green to my flower mix, this time I pulled some of the flower mix over to the green area to mix together and mute the green. I also feel mixing a little of one colour with the other helps to give a colour palette which works together. There are no jarring hues, but hopefully a peaceful, calm vibe. As I mentioned, I had 3 brushes working the highlights, midtones and shadows. I think it's particularly hard to maintain the highlights, and I tried to be aware of those as I painted. I still think I need some practice on that point though. I love to see flower petals fade out to almost nothing and yet have deep rich colour at the flower centre. With the base layer painted, I went back in with a few extra touches here and there, and by adding to the shadows, this emphasised the highlights more. For the flower centres, I went with a warm glow using yellow ochre and knocked it back by adding sepia for shadows. I also washed a light yellow layer over a few of the petals to spread the warm glow over those too. I mixed up a fresh batch of white gouache in my palette that I keep for gouache and perfect pearls, and used a small brush and added a few drops of white to the flower centres for highlights. And then, seeing as I had my palette out, I splattered liberally with the usual go-to of white gouache, leftover paint and perfect pearl solution. I dried the panel and removed the painter's tape, keeping the card flat to the board and preventing warping. Removing the tape is also a nice experience, but also the blue can be so distracting, and it is lovely to see the panel without that. I've tried other painter's tapes, but I always come back to this 3M one, as it seems to have the perfect balance of being sticky enough to do the job without being too sticky and pulling up the paper. I do love the sentiment strip sets for quick and easy greetings. There really is a set for any occasion, and these reverse wedding strips are perfect for the season. I'm not sure whether weddings are going ahead in your part of the world, but finally small weddings are being allowed here in the UK, and there must be a backlog of people waiting to tie the knot. I trimmed out a couple of the coordinating greetings from the set into skinny strips, and then trimmed down the watercoloured piece. I added foam tape to the back of everything, and then adhered the card front to a card base and cut and scored from a fog card. I then used a T-square ruler to add the sentiment strips offset to the right of the card. I finished off with a trio of pearls. I love these eggshell pearls from Little Things by Lucy's Cards at any time, but I think they go particularly well with a wedding theme. So there's my take on this beautiful, delicate outline flowers set. The muted palette speaks to me, but I've seen this set coloured in a wide range of styles. At Simon, you'll find lots of inspiration for using a set in the small thumbnails below the product image. It's always a good way to see the versatility of a set before making a purchase. That's me for today. On the Simon Says Stamp blog, you'll find a coordinating blog post, as well as details of the supplies I've used. If you want to find me, I blog over at limedoodledesign.com. I want to thank you for joining me, and I'll see you next time.